The light will turn green. Okay.
Is it on?
And yeah, don't talk. Yeah. Oh wait, that's fine. Come on up. Come on.
Too
Have a
late
seat.
now.
Have a seat. Hi everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. My name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here. I see a lot of new faces. How many of you are joining us for the first time tonight? Oh, okay, great. So the Center for Fiction is a 200-year-old cultural nonprofit. Our mission is to encourage people to read and value fiction and support its creation and enjoyment. And in a minute, I'll tell you why we're doing this event, because it's different. We do this through public events like this one, reading groups and writing workshops, all offering vibrant, accessible, and inclusive programs that welcome a wide community to experience the joy of story. Our Kids Read program offers immersive reading experiences for children, and we support early career writers with our first novel prize and our Emerging Writers Fellowship. So visit our site, sign up for our mailing list, and follow us on social media. And if you like what you see, become a member, and you'll be tuned into all of our activities. We have a member floor above us that's a beautiful library space where you can read and write collectively. And be sure to register for our final event of the season, which is next week on the 19th. It's a celebration of James Baldwin's centennial, The Evidence of Things Unseen, Baldwin, Faith, and Fiction, with Yadin Israel, the senior editor at Simon & Schuster, and Robert Jones Jr., formerly known as son of Baldwin and author of The Prophets. That'll be a great conversation. A few logistics for tonight. After the talk, we'll have a Q&A. It'll be a little bit longer of a Q&A because this is a part of our On America series. If you're here in the room, raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you so that folks who are watching on the YouTube can hear your questions as well. And if you're joining us on the live stream, please add your question to the chat, and we'll read those from the back of the room. This is a topic that I know everybody has very strong opinions about, and I imagine that's why you're all here. And so I would just ask during the Q&A that you be mindful of sharing the time with your neighbors and making sure that everybody gets a chance to ask their questions. Tracy and Leonardo were kind enough to pre-sign the books, and we'll be doing a personalization line just on the other side of this wall after the event, and so please stick around. And for the main event, tonight is part of our On America series, which brings writers, journalists, activists, and change makers together to reflect on the critical issues of our times. New York, with support for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this conversation do not necessarily represent those from the National Endowment of Humanities. We are grateful for their support. We live in the world. Thank you as well to our program partners, the Crown Heights Tenants Union. And for our panel. There are, by the way, there are more seats up front, and it's not really a spitting kind of panel, so if you want, come on up. So we're happy. This is the third event that we've done this season that's focusing on land ownership and housing in America, and investigating the histories and systems that have brought us to this housing crisis that we are living through right now. We're happy to welcome writers and organizers Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Vilches. Tracy, Leonardo, who are the authors of Abolish Rent, How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. And joining them are Tara Ragavir, founding director of KC Tenants and the National Tenant Union Federation, and Esteban Huron, member of the Crown Heights Tenant Union for over 10 years. Let's give them a big round of applause.
All right. Hi, everyone. There is still room up here, so scooch up if you can't hear, can't see, or if you just want to be closer to us. My name is Tara Ragavir, and I'm an organizer with KC Tenants in Kansas City, Missouri. And thank you. We love Kansas City, and we love the tenant union. I'm also an organizer with the National Tenant Union Federation, and I'm so excited to be here with organizers and comrades who I love, and I am so excited that you all get to be here with us to learn from them. We are here because a brilliant book has entered the world. It is called Abolish Rent, and it is an essential primer. It's an essential primer on rent and the struggle that will be required for us to release ourselves from the grasp it has on our lives. And Leo and Tracy are the authors of this book, and this book is not only an essential primer, but also a brilliant gift from two longtime organizers who are not just writing a manifesto about the rent, although it is that, and it is that brilliantly, but also charting a course forward and telling us some amazing and human stories from the LA Tenants Union that they have co-founded. The tenant union, I wanted to start because I was like, who's going to be at this thing, and what exposure do they have to this as a concept? So tenants are stronger together than they are as individuals, and that's the basic concept of a tenant union. Many of us have different ways that we might define tenant union, and maybe we'll get into that, but a tenant union to me is a school. It's a place where people come together across all sorts of lines and become politically educated and activated. A tenant union is a vehicle for solidarity. It's where we can help each other meet material needs sometimes. And maybe most importantly, it is one of the most exciting and potent ways that we can express our power. Mm-hmm. And I think that's primarily what we're here to talk about tonight. Mm-hmm. So let's get into it. Mm-hmm. Leo, can you tell me a little bit about the Los Angeles Tenant Union and how it came to be, the prehistory, the history, whatever you want to give us?
No, we were born in the struggle of against the demolition of public housing in the late 1980s under a Democratic administration, Bill Clinton and Henry Cisneros in HUD. The federal government decided to demolish public housing. 100,000 units of public housing were going to be demolished across the country. And we were working in the largest public housing west of the Mississippi, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, which is really well known in Los Angeles because that's a place where a lot of very progressive and advanced work on dealing with gangs was born, out of a community that had been organized for a long, long time to reduce the violence, intervene when the police was going on, negotiate truces, so on and so forth. And when the federal government came to say, we want to demolish this building because you're going to have a better life, the community was very suspicious. They had organized themselves, they had a community, they had a spiritual place where they were able to build themselves and rebuild themselves. And they decided to fight against it. And all of us who were working in that community at the time didn't know anything about public housing, the rights of the tenants, and anything like that. But we started organizing and saying, well, we want to fight back. We want to resist the demolition. These about 1,200 families that decided to stand against the federal government, but not just against the federal government, against everybody and their grandmother. Basically, we had nonprofit organizations that wanted to receive money for their programs, even though the people who were going to benefit from the programs was going to be displaced. Housing developers that were going to build affordable housing that wasn't going to be affordable to the tenants. And a nonprofit organization, all sorts that wanted to look good in terms of the government and endorsing this policy. So against all odds and against everybody that decided to fight, And it took us about 10 years to fight with all the community. And at the end of the day, only 250 families were able to negotiate a contract for them to stay in the development. So we were born out of a defeat. The people lost, 2/3 of the community were displaced, but this community decided to stay, and they won their place there and decided to stay. The people that were displaced started going to move into other places. And an interesting thing that we discovered is that the housing where they're moving into was worse than the public housing that they were coming from. Even though there's all these myths and stereotypes about people who live in public housing, housing was worse in private housing. So we decided to start organizing with them. And as we were talking to people about rent strikes, about change in the housing conditions, it was very hard to find support amongst the nonprofit organizations who have a mission, who have a funding, who have all these resources, but they don't have the capacity to organize tenants who want to fight to stay in their homes. They had all the money to fund more housing that wasn't affordable to the tenants. So we started pushing to try to form a tenants organization, a tenants union. And also because of our struggle against public housing, we realized that a small community just in struggle was not able to do anything. After several years of working on this issue, we met Ultra Red, which is a group of artists. We were part of a collective of artists that were doing work in other parts of the country and the world around gentrification. We were visiting different places in Ireland and the fight against gentrification, in Germany, the fight of immigrants, and learning a lot about those struggles. But we would come back to Los Angeles and everything would be the same. So out of that project, we decided to form something that was called School of Echoes, which was activists and volunteers and people from the community that would come to talk about what was going on in their community. And we would have regular meetings, get-togethers, and talk about what's going on in the community. And little by little, the topic of gentrification became very apparent, and the issues that were pushing people out of the neighborhood became very visible. And once again, the conversation about forming a tenants union developed. And but again, nobody knew what to do. Everybody was like figuring out things, and these are people who were not conditioned by the common sense of what organizing is, what politics is. They just wanted to do something in their community to save their community. And in one meeting we were having in our office in the Unión de Vecinos, which is also the local that invented it. Well, that was part of the foundation. And in that meeting, we started negotiating. I figured, well, how do we start? Where do we start? We don't have funding. Nobody is really interested in doing a tenants union. And Tracy here said, well, a tenants union has member. Here's $5. Let's start a tenants union with the first member. So here we have tenant member 00001.
Money on the table. Let's go.
Exactly. But the whole point is people who were not involved in traditional ways of struggling decided to do something. Out of that meeting, people went to different parts of the city where struggles were going on that were not getting support. Section 8 tenants that didn't have any support, whose contracts were finishing and were being displaced, decided to fight to stay. Tenants who were being pushed out because the landlords had really bad conditions and harassing the tenants, decided to stay. And little by little, across the city, we were growing from 3, 4, 5 locals to 16 locals that we have now in the city. Over time, we were able to have the largest membership, which is 3,000 tenants that are dues-paying members, the support organization, and started winning little battles. And more recently, during the pandemic, we launched the first rent strike, which was across the city, which was food, not rent. So our organization has grown from a community of people who didn't know how to organize, that little by little has come together and say, we have to fight back to recover the city. And now from 16 organizations, we're all coming together and saying, how can we duplicate our efforts? We're talking about growing 2,000 people more this year in the middle of these processes, how to fight back at gentrification, how to push back the bad landlords, and just have a real political power in the city so other people don't ever decide what they have to do with our housing.
Beautiful. Give it up for Leo. So I feel like I've heard you say before, but it really hit me in a new way today, that LA Tenants Union was born out of a defeat. And I actually think we should all acknowledge that everything that we're doing, everything that we're building out of defeat right now. We are defeated by real estate capital. We're sitting right now in a site of defeat by real estate capital, and the tenant union offers an intervention. Tracy, speaking of interventions, tell us about the intervention that this book makes, and talk to us about the rent. When you were in Kansas City just the other week, I asked you, I was like, there was this piece that Mariam Kaba, a brilliant abolitionist, had to write that was like, no, literally, we mean abolish the police, do you literally mean abolish rent? And if so, what does that actually mean?
Well, to be clear, we literally mean abolish rent. When this book was written from, and I just want to say first, thanks for everyone for having us here. It's special to me because 2 stories up on Christmas Day, I was here working on this book. So I just needed to be thank you for everyone for having us back. But as Leo said, this book really came out of the insights and the experience of tenants and who are struggling against this housing system that has not their human need for housing in mind, but landlords and developers' profits. And when you look at that housing system, what you discover, right, is that actually it's an unhousing system. Right now, there are 650,000 people who are homeless every night, and that is technically outdoors. The people who are living precariously on couches, in cars, in week-long stay hotels, it's 4 times the amount. So when we asked ourselves, what does this housing system actually do from the perspective of tenants, right? It makes our landlords and developers rich, and it ejects us onto the streets. And so from that perspective, right, where there are 7 evictions filed every single minute, when tenants can't remain in the long-term communities that they helped create, we really wanted to start from the notion that everyone deserves a place to live, right? Housing is not only a human right. It's also the source of our connections to our communities, the place where we have the most intimate moments of our lives. It transforms it makes possible so much of what we get to do, what schools we get to go to, where and how we live. And for us, we were really, we organized both housed and unhoused tenants, and that was so important for us to understand that, a tenant is anyone who doesn't control their own housing. And so what do we need to do as organizers? We need to create infrastructures and communities to take back that control of where and how we live. And to answer your question, I think one of the things that we really wanted to do in this book too was give a really accessible but common sense way of understanding what rent is, right? This, which is in many ways a way of talking about how this thing that is a human right has been made into something that we have to pay for, right? So if we don't own property and we get we leave our parents' house, we have no choice but to pay rent, right? So what is rent? It's a fine for having a human need. If we, our landlords, when we think about who our landlords are, how do they get to own our housing? Well, they don't own our housing because they're better than us or smarter than us or more hardworking than us. And does anyone know how many, I've done this before, does anyone know how many hours a month an average landlord spends on maintaining an apartment? It's 4. Thank you to the person who's heard it. Thank you to the well-read person in the back. So 4 hours a month, right? They don't own our housing because they're more hardworking than us. They own it because they or their parents or their parents' parents had more money than us, and they were able to take that money, hoard the places where human beings can live, and then charge us for access to that human need, right? So rent is a tribute. What is rent also? It's a trap, right? It means that as we have to pay our landlords over and over and over again, we get further away from that so-called property ladder that would mean ever getting out of it, right? So this is really the insight that I think comes from organizing with tenants, from the moral and ethical and political position that housing is a human right. The abolition of rent is, the process by which we as a society would achieve housing as a human right.
Beautiful. Can I ask a follow-up?
Please.
There was an election last week.
Yikes.
What does that mean for everything that you just said and the sort of defeat that we live within? What does the election mean one way or another?
Yeah, I think it's really important just to start out with like what were the platforms that were offered to people this election cycle. On the one hand, there was mass deportations as a solution to the housing crisis, right? To kick populations out of the country to decrease demand. And then on the other hand, you had developer subsidies, right? Like part of this long process that Leo was talking about that is a bipartisan process of democratic politicians abandoning public housing, abandoning rent control, and replacing them with Republican LIHTC and Section 8. Right? And that these are the go-to democratic strategies now that were invented by Republicans, used to destroy public housing, and are now the only offering of the Democratic parties is privately owned, publicly subsidized housing. And so I think when we look at those offerings and we recognize the crisis that tenants are facing, the effect that this crisis has on our health, on our ability to, the tenants across the country who are starving, giving up medication, living in overcrowded and like despicable conditions, as we all very well know. And that context, for that context, to have the Democratic Party offer themselves as the party of joy, I think really, as I said earlier, right, like from the perspective of its winners, the housing system works just fine, right? So landlords make over $500 billion a year and work only 4 hours a month. And as a class, they make $500 billion a year, not an individual. Sorry, I should say that. And individually, they work 4 hours a month. And I think that, right, like, so that is the perspective of its winners, right? Like, joy is the platform of the winners. And I think that, these very, and also, it was these very strategies, right? Like how Donald Trump made his millions was by flipping the developer subsidies that are now the Democratic plank. So we can really see in his rise the way that like the rise of the public-private partnership, this muddled message, then paves the way for a person to both make billions of dollars, take out $1 billion, make $1 billion in bunk mortgages, and also paves the way for, the evacuation of the party as having any meaning. And so I think right now, from the perspective of tenants, it's really important for us to build the institutions ourselves, to build the local democracy that we need, beginning in our building, in our tenants associations, in our blocks, in our neighborhoods, and think about how we can grow that power to transform this system that has in many ways abandoned us. In our book, we call this century of housing policy the war on tenants, because it is the abandonment of tenants to the whims of the private market for the enrichment of the elite. And I think that this process of really meeting people in their homes, in their neighborhoods, is really that's what we have. And I know that's what you do, so now I get to flip it back to you, which I'm really excited about. You once wrote, and I wrote it down so I can quote you absolutely correctly. It's not a given that the people will prevail against today's odds, but if we have a chance, the chance lives in the tenant union. And I think that's just the sentiment that I was, raising. And I just, I wonder if you could talk specifically about KC Tenants and what you mean by that, and if you think it's still true.
I think it has to be true. I just think it has to be true. It's like I've convinced myself of my own argument. Yes, I think if there's a chance, the chance lives in the tenant union. And I know that and I feel that because I've seen the way it's transformed my hometown. I'm from Kansas City, moved back in 2019, and Casey Tenants was co-founded by Diane Charity, Tiana Caldwell, and Brandy Granados, 3 women who had been on the wrong side of the story that Tracy just told you for their whole lives, and they decided to do something about it. And we've been organizing for almost the last 6 years. We've passed city policy. The tenants in our union have written a tenants bill of rights and passed it. We've won free attorneys for tenants in eviction courts. We've banned voucher discrimination. We do live in Missouri, which is the sunken place. So I do just need to remind you, some of this stuff feels really bare minimum, but for us, like one of the first things we had to do was secure the bare minimum. We've organized tenants in their buildings, in neighborhoods. We've snatched back tens of millions of dollars from gentrifying developers. We've won millions of dollars for truly affordable housing. We elected a member of our tenant union to city council and have reorganized a lot of our city council around the tenant agenda. I'm wearing yellow tonight. I never really walk around in yellow in Kansas City because people know, but Casey Tenants is an institution. It functions kind of like a political party in Kansas City, and 99% of the stuff we do is not actually seen in public. It's our hotline, it's our mutual aid fund, it's the dozens and dozens of meetings every week in church basements, which you can all relate to. Right now, what I want to tell you about that I think is giving me the most hope and reminds me of my conviction that if we have a chance, the chance lives in the tenant union. We've launched our first rent strikes in 2 buildings with federally backed mortgages. In case you don't know, the federal government is in big business with our landlords to the tune of $150 billion a year in financing from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are 2 government-backed banks. And some of the buildings that are financed in this way are some of the worst buildings in this country, and that's certainly true in the Kansas City area. So 2 of these buildings have organized rent strikes, and they launched on October 1st. I think it's day 46 of the strikes. And the strikes have already won so much for the tenants in those buildings. And the strikes are ongoing because they haven't actually won what they're demanding, which is a 3% rent cap, new ownership, and collectively bargained leases. But every day, there's repairs in the building that had gotten completely ignored and neglected for years until the strikes launched. We won $1.35 million for one of the buildings to get repaired from Fannie Mae. That just came down last Friday. The tenants are feeling solidarity with their neighbors, which matters and sustains them through this time. And the strikes keep going, and the strikes will keep going until we win even more than this. Through that organizing, I think Casey Tenants, I was relating to a lot of what you were saying, Leo, about the fits and the starts and trying and failing and learning from the failure. I think we're at this point of trying to understand our strike power because what we saw was that we were getting pummeled. Like if we were organizing building by building, block by block, that wasn't enough. Capital moves faster. And when we were winning policy, that wasn't enough because the capitalists control the implementation of the policy that we win. So we had to start getting serious about the tenant's ultimate power, which is our rent. And we've learned a lot through these initial strikes, which we're considering structure tests. And there's much, much more to come.
Esteban, I just want to bring you into the conversation and ask you, if you could talk about a win that you've had in CHTU that, demonstrates what you guys have been up to in New York.
Sure. So Crown Heights Tenant Union started about 10 years ago, and we're actually not far from here. Crown Heights is very close. As some of you know, this whole area was developed and sort of emptied out of sort of black brownstone Brooklyn, was completely razed. And so there was a situation where we had somebody dealing with deed theft. It was a black family, first black family on the block, and now the only one left on that block on Park near here. And while that family was away, they were evicted. So, doors locked, no way to get back in. And so Crown Heights Tenant Union and Brooklyn Eviction Defense broke back in. We broke back into the building. We set up a blockade. We literally linked together and pushed away the police. And we did this for 28 days. and the family's still in their home 2 years later, right? So, and normally we're working in buildings with tenant associations, but this was like a whole block came together, and we had like the attorney general involved and all these people. It was a huge thing. It was a lot of press, but in the middle of the pandemic, it proved that we could do that we could prevent somebody from being displaced from their home, and so that was radicalizing for a lot of people.
Thank you. I want to pick up something that you talked about, Tara, about our rent. We talk in the book, we devote a chapter to the rent strike, right? As that sort of, combines the two weapons that we have, right? Solidarity and our rent checks. And just to bring in something that, we talked about, if there's a chance, that chance lies in the tenant union. I know that we just had a win of a rent strike in Los Angeles. That was a really, it's like a more recent victory than one that we cover in the book. But I wanted you to talk about it, Leo, specifically because it began with neighbors who hated each other. And I think that is actually starting there to get to where they went. I want to hear you tell that story.
Yes. Well, I mean, Tara, you were talking about it being a school, but also it's a spiritual place. And the union is a spiritual place in the sense that we were talking about growing out of our defeats and building community. And there is this building in the corner of Michigan and I don't remember the name of the street, but Fickett. And basically what happened in this building, we've been organizing for a long, long time. We have a tenants association that has been working to get all fixing on their building, actually they evicted one of the managers in the building, and just improving their conditions every day, getting the housing department to come and do inspections, doing the repairs every day. And they also part of a larger committee of neighborhoods, a neighborhood committee, because basically in the tenants, in the Unión de Vecinos, which is our local, which predates the Los Angeles Tenants Union for 20 years, we have not only organized by building, but also organizing neighborhoods, neighborhood blocks. And in this building, we have one of the strongest leaders in the community. And right next to it is one of these buildings that is also very interesting. After people are being pushed out of their homes in Los Angeles right now, whole families are moving out from 2-3 bedroom apartments into single bedroom units. So basically we're talking about a building that has 8 families living in 8 bedrooms with 1 bathroom, with 2 bathrooms and 1 kitchen. And this building was full of people that are coming from Colombia. And the women were really pissed off in the building that we've been organizing because these guys were having parties every day, smoking pot, doing all sorts of stuff, and staying very loud till midnight, And every time we would have these meetings with them, they would say, well, we should get rid of these guys over here. And we're like, well, we don't do that, right? We have to, but we should call the police, and constantly having all these negotiations and try to convince them not to go in that direction, because we're trying to build unity across the block. But boy, do they hate these guys, because they come in, they occupy all the parking lots. They don't park in the garage because they have their parties, so they go park in the street. There's not enough parking. Trash has been thrown all over the place. And again, we had another meeting. So, let's call the police because an inspector or something like that, and on and on and on and on. So one night, we get a call, and this woman leader, and says, "Hey, something is happening across in the building next door. They're kicking one of the tenants out." And it was this woman. Basically, the inspectors, somebody called the inspectors. The inspector came to the apartment and found out that there were illegal units in the apartment. So basically, he told the manager, you need to demolish these units and you need to kick the tenant down. And the manager, breaking all the laws, basically went in, took all the property of the tenant, put it in a garage, some part on the sidewalk, and threw it away. When the tenant came back from work and her daughter came back from school, they saw that there is no longer an apartment there, and all the stuff was in the trash or in the garage locked up. Mm-hmm. So we go and start talking to them, and we immediately call everybody from the neighborhood. Everybody just comes and picks all the stuff up, opens the lock of the garage, and brings all the housing back into the unit, and starts pretty much building walls and doing the stuff so she could stay back in the house. And then we start listening to the story, and the woman's like, "Oh, we have to help these people. We really have to help these people." Mm-hmm. And I'm like, "Well, these are the people you were hating." But the sense of solidarity, the sense that this shouldn't have happened, was very, very strong. And basically, as they started organizing, and we started talking to the families, we realized that the owner of that building is owner of 60 bedrooms across different parts of the city where people are living under the same kinds of conditions. So as we learned that, the woman said, oh, you guys have to start organizing with them. So basically, she joined the fight to start organizing these tenants in this neighborhood. So we go and start the rent strike. And basically, across the city from downtown, South Central to East Los Angeles, the tenants are organizing. And actually, my son is one of the organizers in this process. And these are mostly undocumented immigrants that had just arrived very shortly into the United States. They know very little about their rights. They just know, this is the place where they have to be. And then we start learning there's roaches in the apartment, there is rats, and the women are being sexually harassed by the manager. So the members of this building start organizing the people of the other buildings. In one of the local meetings, the manager comes and maces one of the leaders of the apartment. So a big fight develops, a struggle there. The police comes, they arrest the manager, and we keep organizing. So they go on a rent strike, and it's 1 month, 3 months, 5 months. And I'm really getting nervous because, it's time to negotiate. And my son is like, no, fuck this landlord. We're going to push back until he does everything we want. I'm like, well, yes, but, you should really sit down and negotiate. And my son says, no, fuck no, we're not going to do this. And I'm like, well, okay, fine. So I go to his meeting. I say, well, okay, I'm going to fix this. So I go to the tenant and say, guys, the time is coming. We really have to sit down and start organizing the mass. I say, fuck the landlord. We don't want to do this. So I'm totally undermined through this whole process because they just don't care. They're ready to fight all the way to the end. Well, in the process, 6 months later of pushing and pushing and pushing, 6 months later and $500,000 later, the tenants sit down with the landlord. The manager still in jail. The woman who was picked up becomes the manager of the building, and the tenants get their $500,000 forgiven in rents.
Love it.
But it's very important because as we build this movement, consciousness is developed, but also the sense that we have to support each other. And then also in the process of these negotiations, people start saying, well, let's figure out how we park and what are the rules that we're going to have now as neighbors and stuff like that. But this sense of solidarity starts transforming the neighborhood. And I think it's very important also to think about it. We're talking about the Democrats and the party and all these processes. This wasn't built in 20 years or in 30 years or in 6 years. What we have right now as a government has been built over time because of the breaking down of our relationships and because of the building of a common sense that tells us this is the way that you participate politically in this country. Mm-hmm. This is the way that decisions are made. These are the people who make the decisions for you, and these are people who are going to tell you what to do. We have to build the relationships in our community, in our buildings, in the blocks, in the neighborhood, and build the locals that starts transforming politics, that starts transforming our relationships, and that starts building a different way of looking at the world. A world that says, fuck this, we're not going to take it, we're going to do it differently. Mm-hmm. And this is what we learned from these Colombian people. Mm-hmm.
I see that we're running low, but I wanted to, Esteban, I really wanted you to talk specifically about your unions organizing at Pinnacle, because I think that a tenant union is a capacious form, and our landlords, our landlords are global, and they are implicated in financial systems across the globe, and in this case, in financing the genocide that is ongoing in Gaza. And I think that it's, the way that I just want to hear you talk specifically about that building and how you're, connecting the dots between this landlord that takes money from poor and working class people and funds and drops it into the Israeli stock market to boost, the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. And I think that the way that you're weaving, like I was just at I was at an association meeting on Monday night talking about my own rent strike and hearing about that rent strike, which is then like withholding that money from that entire system. So I want to know how you built that and how you're thinking about the solidarity that is being built, that is global, that is international.
So the Palestine Solidarity Working Group out of Khan Yunis Union started really without any sort of idea of what we were going to do. I think the first action that we went to was Raquel down here, Ridgewood Tenant Union, had a huge action and trying to find ways to connect the dots between the things that tenants were experiencing, the displacement that we're experiencing, and the displacement and dispossession that's happening in Palestine. And so this landlord, Pinnacle, we've been tangling with Pinnacle for the entire time that we've been a union. They're just one of the most notorious landlords. They own over 9,000 apartments. They now are, they basically would buy them. They would buy the apartment. They flip the building, try to deregulate it. Then they would put those buildings up as collateral to raise money on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. And so we started realizing that we could actually, if our rent is going to that, then withholding our rent means that we're actually contributing to the end of this, right? And that's a really motivating thing for people, because it's really easy to feel like there's nothing you can do. So here was something that we could do. And what's interesting is that it turned into, it always comes back to the tenant association. Now we're door knocking, we're going, we're building in 10 buildings right now in Crown Heights. And that's before we even get out, we haven't even started getting out to the other neighborhoods that have the same landlord. But to find that we're doing essentially the same thing, but came to it from a totally different perspective. And yeah, Tracy and I were at a wine and what was it?
Wine and paint.
Yeah.
They were painting a banner that said, it was like a rent strike banner with a really, on rent strike to hang out their window with a really beautiful rat on it.
Yes, and that building had wins too, and even though they've had wins, they're really committed to doing this rent strike, and that's sort of taking off all over the neighborhood. We've done rent strikes. We've been doing rent strikes. Because as you said, it's the only thing that we have that we can actually cause some sort of change. And normally it wouldn't work with landlords like Pinnacle because out of 9,000 units, this is just a handful. But once you start connecting it that way, you start getting the media involved. There's so many ways to change the conditions that you're in, and these conditions are really, really bad. We're talking about slumlord, awful, there's no way that you would want to live there, but people still live there. And so the rent that's supposed to be going to making these repairs is going to fund the genocide. And so that's incredibly motivating for people to know that they can be a part of that and they can actually stop that process directly.
Thank you so much. I see that we're about at questions, but I just wondered, Tara, if you wanted to close us out in just thinking about, maybe you and I have maybe I'm springing this on you, but you and I have been talking a little bit about the 2028. I feel what are we moving towards as a movement? I know one thing that's been on my calendar is UAW put 2028 as the deadline that all different shops should set their contracts to reset on that date, seeding the ground for a general strike. And there was someone who came to our event in Louisville who was organizing in Amazon, and I was talking about how the discipline for a strike is often that you can't pay the rent, right? They want to wait you out until you lose your housing. So I think that there's a role to play for tenant organizing in supporting worker struggles. There's a role to play for tenant organizing in international struggles, right? There's a role to play for tenant organizing in rebuilding the community ties that have been broken down by processes of gentrification and the kind of animus of the animus that comes from living in these isolated and alienated boxes, but really thinking about the role that tenant organizing can play as we go forward. And I wondered, I'm gonna kick that to you and be what's next? Sorry.
No, it's quite all right. There's calls every week on the internet for a general strike, and that's a fun vibe on the internet, I guess.
Yeah.
But to actually organize a strike is quite a serious endeavor, and we have to take it seriously.
Yes.
We all know this because we've been part of strikes ourselves, but I think I see part of my project in collaboration with you all and probably people in this room, as like figuring out the path to actually stage a large-scale economic disruption, because that is what it will take. And I think we actually just have to be so serious about what we are up against. What we are up against, which you describe in the book and just now so well, is the most potent forces in the world. It's not even in America. Like, yes, the realtors are the top lobby in this country, but we are talking about the most potent, powerful forces in the global economy is what we're contesting against. So we cannot be cute with it. We actually just can't. We have to be very serious about that. And that requires us to operate with a huge amount of humility, curiosity. You're sitting with a bunch of organizers with very different opinions, actually, about how to go about a lot of different things. And I think there's a lot of respect among a crew of us who are actually really serious about what we're up against and trying to ask other people for feedback on what's worked, what's not worked, what are the steps? What are the steps to build a majority union in a building that can then build towards a supermajority rent strike that can actually exact some sort of outcomes from the landlords, but also look to bigger targets as well. And we, I think, should move to the audience questions, but we were gonna have a whole section of this conversation on targets.
I know.
Right, and I think like part of the contribution that I have in this group is saying like, it's actually not just our landlords, it's the state that's enabling them as well. And we have to get equally serious about a set of targets that are captured by real estate capital and doing their bidding. And kind of the last word that I have is like, we have to do all of it at once. That is actually our project. It's the mutual aid, it is the book clubs, it is, you know, political education about Palestine and international solidarity, and it is the serious and rigorous work of building unions that can actually wield a kind of power that's not available to us now. And at Casey Tenants, we say all the time, we are building something that none of us has experienced, but all of us deserve. And I think that is the project that we're also committed to, because it's our only chance.
Let's kick it over.
Yeah.
We want to kick it out to the audience because the clock said we must.
We were told that the clock said we must.
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, this appeared out of nowhere. Hello. Thank you guys so much. Wow. Sorry, everyone just turned around so dramatically. I just have a question about like logistics and infrastructure and how you think about scaling the organizing that you're doing from like a building to a block to a neighborhood to a city, and how do you sort of like have people maintain relationships, like figure out how decisions are made, figure out leaders. I'm sure that's a big question, but any thoughts you guys have on that would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, for me, it's the issue of time. I mean, as I was saying, our local predates the tenants union by 20 years. And it's been time to build relationships in the neighborhood, in the buildings, in the neighborhood. But also it's about scope. And this is where we would have to have a great conversation around this stuff. It's not just about winning the right to housing for tenants. It's about winning the right to the city. And in that process, it's not just about winning what happens in your building, but what happens in your block, in your street, in your neighborhood, and so on and so forth. And just to give you an example, in the 20 years that we built our local, we started just looking at the neighborhoods and the potholes and things that happen. And in our neighborhood, which is about 100,000 people, we have about 20 committees of people who are like dedicated to cleaning up their alleys, distributing food in some places of the neighborhood, engaging in campaigns to stop traffic, to slow down traffic, so on and so forth. Over these 20 years, we were able to build a network of committees in the neighborhood that when the city decided to start an arts district right across from where the public housing that we fought for was there, the tenants from all these networks decided to fight back. And everybody came, the Maoists and the anarchists, and everybody came to help and join these women in doing the fight. But the fight was done by the neighbors themselves. And when there was an opening of an art gallery, the women would go there and start roasting chiles right at the entrance of the gallery, as blowing the smoke into the place. The gang members were harassing the visitors, and so on and so forth. The whole neighborhood was involved in pushing the arts galleries out of this place. There is not a single art gallery there anymore. They're gone. They're gone. But it took us 20 years to build the power that told the council member, you're not going to have an art district here. The guy, by the way, is in jail now for corruption. But it's very important to think in terms of the construction of relationships, the construction of a system, the construction of a structure, learning together, and then knowing that we control the territory where we live, not just the neighborhood, but the larger block where 100,000 people live. So it's time, and we're in a race, right? Capital moves faster than us, but also we need to build a relationship that hold the ground and say, no galleries here, we need subsigns here, so on and so forth. We need to become managers and learn how to be managers of our city.
I would just add, in Kansas City, I forgot to mention this, we have 10,000 members, and the way we actually measure membership kind of depends who you ask in the union. We have 10,000 people have signed up and say they're members of the tenant union, and we have like 300 to 500 people who are like actively moving work for the tenant union on a daily or weekly basis. And I think the question of scale is really a question about how a small cadre of people can get out of the way so that other people can take ownership of their own experience and like do the work of building a union together. We do a lot of trainings and leadership development because here's the truth is like our people, like the people in our tenant union have been told by every structure and system that they're not leaders and they're not in charge of their lives. So there's actually a really important project in the tenant union of developing leaders to recognize their own leadership and their own ownership of their path to liberation. So that's what I would say about KC Tenants. And I also think some of the work that we've done that's electoral is as much about scale and like building our power at scale as it is anything to do with the election outcomes. We just picked a big fight this spring to go up against the Chiefs and the Royals. Our football team and our baseball team wanted to put a stadium downtown, and our people said, fuck a downtown stadium. And we were the only organized opposition to the stadium, and we thought we were gonna lose. I spoiled it a little bit, but we thought we were gonna lose because it's two billionaires and their teams, and if any of y'all have been to Kansas City or heard anything, you might know that the only civic identity in Kansas City is the sports teams. So we were up against a lot, and we organized like our lives depended on it, because they do. Yeah. And we actually saved our arts district and saved a lot of homes. But we beat them so badly. We beat the, like 56% of our county voted with the tenant union. That does not mean they're all members of KC Tenants. Some of them are like the wives of cops out in the burbs, right? But they voted with the tenant union and only the tenant union, and that is also meaningful, and I think that's also a kind of scale that the tenant union has an obligation to think about.
Thank you. Do we want to take another? Yeah, Mike, we could take a couple.
Thank you. So you've all talked about the rent strike as a solution or an option to build collective power. One of the major issues that is sort of adjacent to that is there's a massive housing shortage, and that allows landlords to use the market and the lack of housing to drive up prices for tenants, to make them so inaccessible, to make people have to leave if they can't pay and all of that. And so I'm wondering, so we need more housing. I mean, in New York City, for example, there is the number of homes that are available is way fewer than the number of unhoused people. And so we also need more housing built in this city and many other cities. So I'm wondering sort of how these two things interact and how new housing can be built in a way that is not just serving the needs of the real estate capitalists, because at least to my knowledge, and I'm not an expert here, but that is also a need. So wondering what the interplay is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I feel like we should frame the question around who gets to build housing and what kind of housing gets built, right? We know who gets to build housing because the government has abandoned its role in building public housing for poor and working class people. And we know what housing gets built, which is the vast majority of the housing that is built right now is luxury housing. We know that what they call affordable housing is subsidized for people who make in Los Angeles, it's more than $80,000 a year. So we are building, and here it's like up to, I saw Leah is here.
Yeah, no,
I'm
City
like,
Planning Commissioner.
I saw Leah is here, right? What?
Even like up to 160,000.
Great. So exactly, right? So if even up to $160,000, like right now, like let's actually pause and think about that. We're living in a time when the state, federal, and local governments are subsidizing people who make $160,000 a year. Does that sound like a housing system that works? Does that sound like a housing system that's built to house the most people in the best quality housing? No, right? And so I think that when we talk about building more, what we're talking about is leveraging state power. How are we going to do that, right? And that is how these two things are connected, right? We don't have the power to make demands, to extract concessions from the state that we desperately need if we're going to house unhoused people, if we're going to house immigrants that are new immigrants, if we're going to house, if we're going to house everyone who needs housing. Also, we need power in our privately owned buildings. There is no reason why I bet a lot of us in this room are spending the majority of our wages so rich people can get even richer. And building power in our own buildings such that we can remove like that money. Like another way that our rent checks get recirculated is as lobby money, right? That then gets to write the laws. And so when we're withholding rent, like I am and I have been for 2 years, like when we do that, we're withholding money from that entire system. And when we educate ourselves to like participate in a broader project, like that's the relationship between those two things in my mind.
I'll just add, just in terms of New York City, there's not actually a housing shortage. We have plenty of places for people to live. Downtown Brooklyn, most of these buildings are empty. Yeah. They're empty luxury buildings. These are not, they're not affordable for any of the people that live in the area. Well, maybe the ones that move in here. And so part of the problem is we have obvious displacement happening so that these buildings can be built and they have 20% affordability. Like this building, in fact, that I just found out used to be an SRO, right? Oh, now, yeah, so we're losing the housing that is actually affordable. And there's different interventions. We were able to pass in 2019 the strongest rent laws in a generation in New York. Made a huge difference. Now you can't deregulate apartments, but we had to get involved in that. Like we're super hyper local. But we had to go and get arrested in Albany and do all this stuff because it was the only way to prevent any more of those units from leaving. But yeah, there's plenty of apartments. They're just not the kind of apartments that we actually need. So that's going to take that's going to take like a state housing authority that's actually producing public housing.
I just want to make sure everyone here is clear on two numbers. Tracy said there's 650,000 people in this country, the richest country in the history of the world, who sleep on the streets every night. There's 16 million vacant homes in the United States today. Just putting it out there. And then I also think a thing I want to point out, Esteban, is you said we're losing that affordable housing supply that exists. I would actually say we have to use active language. We are not losing affordable housing.
Yeah.
Landlords are hiking the rent and dispossessing people of their homes.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Hi. I'm curious what kinds of connections you would like to see further develop, be nurtured in terms of connections between the grassroots organizing and more, quote, official, established, like loci of power. I think, Tara, you mentioned that in Kansas City, you had helped elect one of your tenant members to the city council. I'm forgetting your name. Sorry, for Crown Heights. Esteban. Like being in Albany, like how do you see that interplay? Do we just like flood official places of power with people? I don't know.
Leah, do you want to do The State Comes to Us?
Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, in our, basically, let me tell you something about.
This is me organizing him to
I
do
know,
the thing
but,
that I know that he can say.
To me, it's a question of power. I really, we have to come to a place, and that's why I'm thinking we need to reorganize how we organize ourselves. In our neighborhood, we had one of the most corrupt council members who eventually supported us on the gallery's question. Basically, at the end of this process, he basically said, before you put any business in the neighborhood, you have to ask the people from public housing to see if they agree with the project. And of course, we voted no on everything, and the council members said, oh, well. Now, meanwhile, he was doing things somewhere else, but he respected our territory. More recently, our council member, who also was under investigation because of racist comments and behind closed doors, and that, thank God, he just lost the elections this time. Basically, we will force them to create a special law in our neighborhood to stop all demolitions for until a new planning process is developed. And basically, this is something that we were mobilizing. So in our neighborhood, in our little part of the district, we have been able to negotiate our council members to stay away from us. It doesn't matter who wins. We've been able to do that stuff. The next step is to elect the right person. But for that, you need to have the volume, the organization, the power, and the vision that needs to happen. But yes, eventually we need to change that. Right now, look at the country. Look at the options that we had. They were crap. Mm-hmm. And that we need to really create new options. But we have to have the power to change those conditions. So the question is, what are the necessary conditions to start changing that? We should not stop where we are. We should not stop at the ballot box. We need to build up in our neighborhoods, in our places where we live, and build the power that is going to change these conditions.
I think too, like one of the things that I notice in the Los Angeles Tenant Union, right, is like organization builds the authority. And the authority is what you use to extract concessions, right? And so creating an authority and creating crises, right? So there are like two different ways that I think that our movement can relate to the state, right? One is by through the organization that we have, where we recognize what are our needs. How can we serve our needs? What?
I want to tell this story.
Okay, now you know what I was trying to get you to say before. I'll say this and then I'll kick it back. So how can we appoint ourselves with the resources that we have to distribute them where we are? And when we lack the resources to do it, right, then we've given ourselves the authority, by organizing, to go and extract those resources from the state. The other role that we have to play is in producing crises, right? And that is such an immense part of the power that we have as tenants, right? In our own buildings, when we're organizing towards a rent strike, we are creating a crisis for our landlord who suddenly was relying on our checks coming every single month, right? It's actually our landlords that are dependent on us to make their money, but we don't get to see that until we've combined our resources together in a strike, right? And so when we reverse that power relationship, we create a crisis. In that individual building, right? This happens at scale, right? We can envision a way to scale up this crisis. Unhoused tenants who in Los Angeles who claimed Echo Park Lake for over a year, right? Who had built the authority to organize that park, to share resources, to engage in harm reduction practices, to create community safety, that to give themselves the authority to organize that, right? To reclaim the public bathrooms that the state had locked up, right? They created a crisis that hundreds of tenants and came in to support them, right? That effort was then wiped out by 700 cops in riot gear who came to evict at gunpoint 140 unhoused people who'd been living and building community in a place for a year, right? But what that community was able to do was create a crisis that demonstrated, and that also demonstrated to us what is possible when people claim space, when they organize, when they share resources, when they draw on solidarity from their broader community, and really, I think in many ways, point us, like, are the vanguard to like what that makes possible. So I'm sorry I went on, but I wanted to think through like those, like the way that I think in that story is really that dynamic of creating a crisis and also like building that sense of authority. Now, I'm sorry, I went on, you can talk.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but we create this crisis by developing our own solutions. And another example that I think is very exemplary of this thing, in one of the corners where we're doing organizing, one of the buildings that we're organizing, there's this corner where you have on one side you have a stoplight, right next to it there's a bus waiting bench, right behind there's an alley that is completely clean and is used as a meeting room, and a block down the street people are distributing food every other week to the people who are in need. Just to hear the story of the stoplight is very important. For a long time, the people who live in that neighborhood had to cross on that corner to go to the school because that was the direct way to go to the school, to take the children to kindergarten. And they were like forever asking the council member to put a stoplight there. They wrote petitions, got 1,000 signatures, and so forth, the classic process that we already know about. But eventually they got fed up and said, well, what are we going to do? They're not going to put it for us. We should do something. So the first thing that they did, they bought these vests and these stop signs, and they started like pretending to be cross guards, like the ones that exist in the school. And there was, every time when the children would come, there was a volunteer there stopping traffic, and the women were able to cross the street. Later on, as they built support there, then we started like organizing this crossing the street gangbuster situations where 100 people would cross the street at the same time and slow traffic down. And another time they would like stop traffic and then start painting the yellow and white lines on the street. We have a saying in our committee, which is "Más vale pedir perdón que pedir permiso."
Yep.
We'd rather ask for forgiveness than for permission. So they painted the lanes and the traffic would start slowing down. Eventually, the police was seeing these things, but they couldn't arrest 100 people crossing the street or the old lady crossing the people on the street. So they go to the council member, and the council member says, what can I do so you guys do this stuff? And said, we put a stop. Like, said, well, we have to do these studies and all this stuff. So we kept doing our own things, and the police complaining because they don't know what to do with us, because we had developed our own solution. We knew what to do to slow traffic down, and it was working, but the police didn't like it, so they came to the council member, and council member came to us. Eventually, after many discussions, the council member brings the Department of Transportation to figure out what they could do. They did a study, and the study didn't pass, so the women continue with their routine. So he gets fed up and calls us to a meeting again and says, we want the stoplight. And so it comes to a place where they tell him, well, we're going to do a study on such and such a day. So we get one day a call from the staff member and say, hey, on such and such a day, there's going to be a study. Please make sure that enough people cross the street. We need this many in this amount of time. Well, of course, we call everyone and say, okay, this is the day. We got our stoplight. The state came to us because we developed our own solution. And there's many things that we've done this way.
Can I answer his question about?
Yeah. And then you want to.
Just to answer your question about like how we engage with Albany, for example, it's very interesting. Like working in coalitions because you've got like established nonprofits that that have been working for decades, and you've got groups like ours that are autonomous that don't really have funding or staff. And I think there's room for both. Like I think that's how we won in 2019, which is. Like we had almost as many, we're a tiny organization, and we had as many people getting arrested that day as some of the other organizations. There's stuff that we can do that they can't. We don't get any funding from politicians, so we can say, fuck you, and there's no consequences for us to do that. We don't take grants. We don't do foundation funding because we don't want to have somebody be able to tell us what we can do. And so there's times when we're able to go step out and do and say things that these organizations are not able to do. So I think there's room for both. There's a lot of contentiousness about how that interaction happens, and we get in trouble all the time in the context of coalitions, like all the time. But I think it's worth struggling through, and I think that's how we've been able to win.
I'm hearing both and brute force. And we can move on to somebody else, but I am also, if there's time, interested in allocation of attention to like electing people into places of decision-making power versus grassroots things, but we can move on to somebody else, and if you just work that in.
It takes a lot of time, and it's usually not worth the effort, is what I will say. But I do think the both and is really important, and I think this is a core tension of the tenant union. We both have to deliver I've been thinking about this a lot in the last week.
Yeah.
The tenant union has to deliver materially something to the people. Like, there are lots of people, maybe some of you here tonight, who might show up to a tenant meeting because you've got all the correct politics, and God bless you for that. A lot of people in this country do not have the fucking time to go to a meeting and sit around and opine, right? The tenant union has to deliver materially for the people. And sometimes that means the tenant union is doing the job that we might actually believe should be the state's responsibility, right? But this is the core tension that I think a lot of us sit in, is like the tenant union has to deliver for the people because the state is failing to deliver for the people because the state is captured by the capitalists. And the tenant union, at the same time as we have to deliver for the people, has to demand that the state gets its shit together and starts delivering for the people at scale that we can't yet achieve.
But we have to understand that we're in a project that has to go to that place. We cannot keep having these fights all the time, everywhere in our neighborhoods, in our organizations, in our unions, in our federations, wherever we are. We need to change the conditions.
Yeah.
Look at where we are right now, because these are the conditions that have been built over time. We need to change that. The project that we have goes beyond serving the needs of tenants, goes beyond putting stoplights on the street, goes beyond having this kind of system that we have that we're fighting against. We have to change the system, and we have to have the power across the city, across the country, that makes those changes possible.
I just want to point out that actually our member, First Front Forest, is the assembly member for this area and was basically brought into the movement by getting arrested with us in Albany, and a year and a half later was able to win an election. So that you also do election work. You do all of it.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions from our online audience too, and we're running out of time. So we're going to take one question from the folks who are streaming. Affordable housing development funds are being made available to developers who are undermining rent stabilization.
That's right.
How can we prevent that?
Yep, that's right. That's a great question. I mean, I think that honestly, what you're, we often refer to affordable housing, which, who could refuse affordable housing, right? But affordable housing is a technical term, right? It refers to LIHTC, which was a Reagan invention tacked on as part of his infamous tax cuts, right? And this is the source of the majority of how the state builds affordable housing right now. And it is that specific housing. We refer to it often as bait and switch housing because it was this form of housing that was used in Clinton's Hope 6 to decimate public housing all across the country, right? It's this form of housing that is sold to our neighbors as don't you want this? Don't you want to participate in building this in your communities? And so first of all, the analysis is correct, right? What we're on this stage talking about is how we build the power in our communities to refuse, right? We've often talked about how, I'm going to quote you, that a lot of these systems are really about negotiating the terms of communities' defeat, right? So affordable housing
without a fight.
What?
Without a fight.
Without a fight, right? So if our defeat, how do we refuse those terms? How do we say no? Right now, we don't have the power to do that, right? So getting really serious about matching that kind of, without becoming undercapitalized self-help, how do we help each other from getting kicked out of our homes? How do we organize where we are to take the steps to grow as a movement, right? That's how we're going to get that power. Right now, we don't have it, and I'm not convinced that the fastest road, it doesn't seem like it has worked to ask to appoint someone as the representative to send them on their way to a machine where we watch them get machined, right? It seems to me I think that all of us are really invested in this project of growing the movement, right? Of getting bigger, of not deputizing someone to do a job that they can't do because we need to transform the system that we're in, not just send someone on their way to beg for crumbs. It was fine. That was fine. I could have done better, but like it was fine.
We're not at the debrief yet.
Well,
Tracy.
welcome to my world. Oh yes. That wasn't the last question. Did you guys have anything to say about affordable housing? I feel like we covered it.
Yeah, it's just
Sorry.
In our neighborhood, we fight against affordable housing. We just don't accept it. And the three tallest buildings that exist in our neighborhood are affordable housing, and nobody who used to live in our neighborhood lives there. And they were a consequence of demolition of rent control housing. So basically, whenever people come to our neighborhood and say, we want to build affordable housing, they say affordable to whom? And it's been very, very hard for them to come with new projects for affordable housing. The only project that came was a housing for the homeless, then the NIMBYs rejected, and the community was like, yes, bring it on, and we want that kind of housing. But no, we just say no to affordable housing in our neighborhood, and it's been very difficult for them to do stuff. They also have programs for home ownership, and the tenants say, no, we want housing for tenants, and the city gets really pissed off with us because tenants want rental housing and not housing, home ownership. So it's changing the minds of people over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really, like, if we face the thing that we're up against, right? The thing that we're up against is that our economic system has, well, that, right? But the thing that we're up against is capitalism. The thing that we're up against is that our entire economic system has been devised to grow and raise property values such that the former mayor of Los Angeles can say, in a good economy, homelessness goes up. Right? Like that is the context that we're fighting against. And that's why I really appreciate everyone on this stage being really serious about what our task is and like what our targets are, right? That system that is, these subsidies that participate in the inflation of property values such that tenants can no longer afford their home, right? Those are our targets as well. And so really thinking about how we can negotiate both with our landlords and the state is, I think, our task in moving forward as a movement.
This is actually a great example of what happens when you just give it over to private developers. Not even half of the housing that was supposed to be built right over here at Atlantic Yards has even, none of the things they promised are coming about, and there's no accountability. Nobody knows who to talk to. And that's what keeps happening. So we do ultimately reject most projects that come through because every rezoning that's happened in New York City has caused the displacement of Black and brown people, just as a standard thing. So until the state can provide something that actually will take care of the community and allow us to live in quality housing that is safe, and there's no point in pursuing that or in not fighting back. And we do fight back, and people hate us for it. So.
All right, let's give them all a big hand.
That's it.
But just,
Wait, one more thing.
Just one thing, and this is very important because this is just not a cool talk. This is not just a cool talk when you got to hear people writing a book and then you're gonna go home and watch TV until they're good or whatever you're gonna think. Each one of us here is responsible for this stuff. Each one of us here, whether you're a tenant, a landlord, a homeowner, whatever, each one of you are accountable to this process. Each one of you are part of this system. So I would like to do an exercise that with other tenants, So if everybody stand up.
We're gonna do it?
Yeah.
I'm shocked.
You felt the vibe.
Okay.
So this is one tenant with rats in his house or her house doesn't know what to do about that because, the problem is so big that there is nothing to do. And then they realize that there is a tenant with the same problem, so they go and talk to their tenant and say, you know what, we need to come together and do something about this stuff because this is shit. The landlord is really doing problem for us. This is the tenants coming to visit the people across the street and say, you know what, this is a problem with the street that we need to form and we need to do something about it. They are going now to the tenants union and say, we need to form a local in our community where we have to organize. And these are the locals organizing all together to change the conditions. We are responsible, we are accountable, we're going to change it.
All right, so we got copies of the book at the bookstore, and also I'm sure if you go to Crown Heights Tenant Union's website, you can sign up for more information for those of you who are local. Thank you so much for coming. They'll be personalizing books on the other side of this wall.
Oh no, this is great.